Flying has to be one of the most impactful inventions that we've seen over the last 100, 200 years. And I've always wanted to understand better how exactly did we get to this. Right now we are inside what's called the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, and within this museum there's a section that's dedicated to the Wright brothers and the invention of flying. This is an amazing resource, and my aim for this video is actually to walk through this entire space and try to understand and also try to explain how exactly did we end up flying and flying in these amazing machines called airplanes. I wish to avail myself of all that's already known, and then if possible add my might to help on the future worker who'll attain final success. That quote from Wilbur Wright, one of the Wright brothers, clearly sums up how human invention has always built on itself, because no single person can achieve things which are amazing and would change the world. We've always built on each other's work. The Wright brothers first drew inspiration from a small gift that they got from their father. This was the P-0 helicopter, which would twist and therefore go up, flying like a little toy, and that inspired them to work on human flight. Of course, they began first by building something which was a kite that they would use strings to control, and from then on they moved on to something which was an actual manned glider. If you remember some science that you studied in school, you would know that fluid is inclusive of air as well as liquids such as water, and fluid dynamics therefore applies as much to air as it does to water. And some of the basic concepts of fluid dynamics, such as lift, which is the force that acts on an airplane vertically, which means which takes it up, or drag, which is the force that applies horizontally on an aircraft and therefore it restricts its forward motion. Those forces can actually be calculated from the equations of fluid dynamics, and it was the same equations that helped the Wright brothers understand how exactly they can control the lift, which is the vertical up and down movement of the aircraft, or the drag, which would prevent the aircraft from flying too fast, and they'll be able to reduce its speed by increasing the drag that's applying on the aircraft. Did I say dynamics? I meant fluid mechanics, not dynamics. Now, let's try to understand through an example how exactly an airplane can be lifted up, and therefore we'll also understand what were the basics with which the Wright brothers were working. Now, if you would focus on the middle picture and imagine that the wind is blowing from the left to the right of the screen. Now, in the example of this middle picture, the wind that blows above the wing would be pushed further up, and if you think about Newton's third law of motion, which means every action has equal and opposite reaction, the middle picture would effectively push the wing and therefore the aircraft further down. So this is negative lift. Whereas if you look at the leftmost picture, or actually the rightmost picture, that's the opposite case, which would lift the aircraft further up. Now, this is a very good model of the glider that the Wright brothers had created, and what you see in the front of it is called the elevator, which essentially does the same thing that we saw in the previous example. Moving the elevator down changes the center of pressure. In fact, it moves the center of pressure further forward, and therefore the whole plane goes up because the lift is in that direction. Whereas if the elevator were to be turned this way, you could say turned down or turned up the way you look at it, and the plane therefore would start coming down. So here's an example of how the Wright glider would be flown with an actual human which would be one of the two Wright brothers sitting in it like this so that they can use their hand as well as their feet. But before this happened, they would actually fly it as a kite, maneuvering it with the help of strings. So this is a scale model of the glider that the Wright brothers had built. In fact, this is the 1901 glider, which was the second glider that they created. Initially, for safety purposes and to gather valuable data, what the Wright brothers would do is try to fly it as a kite so that they can see how the different controls are working. Of course, what you see in the front, that was the elevator. Using the elevator, the pitch or the direction in which the aircraft moves up and down could be controlled, and that in turn controls the lift force, which is the vertical force. And there was a control that they had in the back of the aircraft, which they had to operate with the help of their feet, which allowed controlling the right and left direction, which is also called the yaw of the aircraft. And how they made it work was a little special. They did something called wing warping, which means they twisted one of the wings slightly down while the other one was twisted slightly up, and that's how they were able to turn around. Technically, what they were using is called rolling and not really yawing. What you see hanging up there from the ceiling is the model of the actual glider that they used, and a little bit more on that turning movement. So the turning was not really using the yaw movement, but it was using the rolling movement, which means one of the wing would rise while the other one would fall down, and that's how the whole aircraft would turn. And you may actually see modern aircrafts do exactly that to make turns today. The 1900 glider, and facing us is the forward direction of these gliders. The 1902 glider, both of which did not have any propellers, so they were either flown as kites or they would just be thrown up in the wind, and the Wright brothers would try to maneuver how they're flying within that wind without using active power. This, on the other hand, was the actual flyer, which used a propeller and therefore was having its own power to fly around. This, in real terms, was the actual airplane that the Wright brothers had built. And I'd like to once again revisit the different forces that you can maneuver within an airplane. These were true at the time of the Wright brothers. It's also true today. And of course, we'll see the real Wright flyer in a moment. You can see the person there. That's how you would control how this aircraft would fly. Right in the front is the elevator, which when moved up and down would control what's called pitch, which points the nose of the aircraft up or down. In the feet, they had controls for turning the aircraft left or right. There were actually two forces that were in play for turning. They're called yaw and roll, and we can talk about it in a little bit. So the Wright brothers did something called wing warping, which is a bit like wringing a towel as you're trying to take the water out of it. And wing warping produced this motion that's called roll. A roll would mean this side of the wing, for example, goes down, whereas the other one goes up, and that assists in turning. This is part of the wing of one of their gliders. And to once again explain the difference between the Wright brothers' glider and the flyer, glider was something which was not powered. They were mostly test devices that they flew as kites, or they used them in the wind tunnels to better understand how their design is working. The flyer that they eventually used was powered, and this was what allowed modern flight as we know it to be invented. The three pictures that you see here, these are actually the three gliders that the Wright brothers had built to eventually lead to the flyer. that's a model of one of the gliders that they used to test their concepts. And the real deal within this room, if I can call so, is the actual flyer, which is also located right here. So after doing number of iterations with the glider, this flyer, this exact thing that you see here, led to the first human flight. And then, of course, so many people took that idea and improved that idea and built the planes that we fly in today. The Wright brothers were merely in their early 30s when they were able to invent this astonishing flying machine called the airplane. They were born in Dayton, which is a city in Ohio, and for their experiments with the gliders, they went to this place in North Carolina, which is called Kitty Hawk. That place was very windy and it had a lot of sand dunes from which you could fly the gliders. We packed our goods and returned home, knowing that the age of the flying machine had come at last. That's what the Wright brothers said at a press conference after their final test in Kitty Hawk. This was the test of their 1903 glider. They were able to fly for more than 200 meters in almost 1 minute with this glider, and the flight was only at a height of a few tens of feet. I think it reached only about 15 feet. But with that, they were able to invent the basic concepts that even the aircraft of today use to fly and to take us long distances. So let's try to revise those basic concepts of flying. What you're looking at now is a model of the 1905 flyer that the Wright brothers had built. Right in front of it is what's called an elevator. Elevator moves up and down. You can compare this with taking your hand out of a car's window, and whenever you would move your hand up or down, you would notice it goes up and down, like the whole hand moves up just by tilting your palm. Similarly, the elevator would do that, and it helped change the pitch or the angle of the aircraft up and down, and with that, lift is generated, which would literally lift the airplane up. For right and left, there was something at the back of the airplane or the back of the flyer. This is called rudder, and the rudder would move left and right, and it would help the aircraft also do this movement, which is called the yawing movement, the left and right movement, similar to the movement that you would see in a boat as well. And finally, the brothers invented wing warping or twisting of the wings to do something that's called the rolling movement, which is the clockwise or anti-clockwise roll, as you can imagine. And that 1905 flyer that we discussed just now was the first practical flying machine. In fact, it flew more than 24 miles, almost 39 kilometers, and this thing was flying in circles for almost half an hour. And you can imagine, to be able to fly in circles, you also require some amount of maneuverability. And so, while many others tried, the Wright brothers finally helped humankind fly high in the skies. And in the coming years, the impact would be humongous. I mean, just imagine the travel from India to US, which is the travel that I myself undertook. It would take almost 2 months before the invention of the airplane. And now with air travel and the modern jets, I'm able to travel from New Delhi to Washington, D.C. in about 15 hours, which is not even a day. So from 60 days to about half a day. So it's very difficult to overstate the huge impact and iconic status of the airplane and of these inventors, because it honestly just changed the world entirely. It's only fitting that the moment we step out of the Wright Brothers section at this museum, we arrive here where we see modern planes which are all built on the same concepts that the Wright brothers helped invent. And that is how one of the most impactful, one of the most consequential inventions of the modern times came to be. And it's hard to believe that it's only been, like 125 years that the airplane was born. So yeah, that's it. This is me signing off. I hope you like this, and I'll catch you again soon.